Okay, I hear you. Okay, it's 1:00 p.m. and we will get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to the University of Illinois Extension home webinar series called Fill Your Pantry. We have muted everyone. We're double checking to make sure microphones are muted. So just double check with us and make sure that your microphone is off as well as your camera. And that just helps with distraction and background noise so that our presenter can be heard and enjoyed by everyone. And you're welcome to use the chat box. I've been answering some questions along the way, and we check the chat box as we're going through today's presentation and answer questions, but also at the end, we will spend some time with Diane where we can ask some questions that you have. And remember that after our webinar, everyone will receive an email from us with a survey. We appreciate your honest feedback, and then after you return your survey, we send a follow-up email with the program handouts. So that will be coming. So we'll get started, and today's Fill Your Pantry webinar is on freezing foods, and we're happy that you are here with us. And Diane and I would like to introduce each other. So Diane, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining us today. We're super excited to have you here, and I'm pleased to introduce Susan Glassman. Susan is a University of Illinois Extension nutrition and wellness educator. She holds a master's degree in health education and administration and a bachelor's degree in food and nutrition with a specialization in dietetics from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Susan has been with Extension for over 20 years, and she serves Bureau, LaSalle, Marshall, and Putnam counties, and her expertise is in general nutrition, food safety, and chronic disease management.
Thanks, Diane. And go Salukis, right? Go SIU. So it's a pleasure to introduce my colleague, Diane Reinhold, who's also a University of Illinois Extension nutrition and wellness educator. Diane received her Bachelor of Science degree in nutrition and dietetics from North Dakota State University. She then went on to receive a Master of Science degree in nutrition and dietetics and a Master of Public Health degree from St. Louis University, also while receiving her Certificate of University Teaching. Before joining Extension, Diane served as a clinical dietitian where she specialized in medical nutrition therapy for geriatric and critical care populations and diabetes education. She supervised dietetic intern students as well. Diane's special areas of interest include obesity and chronic disease prevention and management, healthful lifestyles, food safety, and food preservation. And for those that may not know, the University of Illinois Extension is the flagship outreach effort of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We offer research-based educational programs to residents of Illinois in all 102 counties and far beyond. So once again, welcome to everyone. And I am going to turn it over to Diane for her presentation.
Thank you again, Susan. I really appreciate it. So today we have a lot of information to cover. So feel free to type those questions in our chat box and we'll hopefully get to most of the questions. But what are we going to do today? Our goal today is to help increase your knowledge and your awareness related to all things freezing. We want to help you have a good understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of freezing. We really want you to have a good understanding of the science behind freezing so that you can get the very best results of your product. Because if you're putting the time and effort in and spending the money to make sure you have good quality produce, you want to make sure you're going to end up with a really good quality product. And so we really hope that you get a lot out of today's presentation. So freezing is simple, easy, and safe. However, there are a few things that you really need to consider before beginning the freezing process. And so some of those questions you need to ask yourself: do I have enough time? Do I have enough quality produce? Do I have the correct equipment, enough storage space? And do you have the knowledge and skills to correctly freeze your product so that you can truly enjoy your harvest all year long? Freezing has many different advantages, and over other food preservation methods, freezing is an effective and safe method for preserving both fruits and vegetables. And it really is one of the easiest and most convenient methods of food preservation, and least time consuming, especially when you compare it to canning. And we talked about canning last week. Freezing allows us to be able to keep the natural color, the fresh flavor, to really hone in and preserve the quality nutrients that our food can provide. It also allows us a little bit more leeway with regards to adapting recipes, especially if we're trying to address any dietary restrictions, like maybe we're trying to cut down on sodium. And we can also adapt a recipe so that it can meet our taste, and we can adapt the portion sizes. Now, with food preservation, one of the big things we always have to talk about is food safety. Food safety is incredibly important. Believe it or not, 1 in 6 Americans are going to get sick this year with a foodborne related illness. So if you think about your 6 closest friends, or maybe your 6 family members that you like the most, well, unfortunately, 1 out of the 6 of you is going to become ill with a foodborne related illness. The chances are very great. In fact, 80 million Americans become sick each year with a foodborne related illness. Of the 48 million, 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 people, unfortunately, are going to pass away due to a foodborne related illness. And it's so unfortunate because foodborne illnesses are preventable. And a lot of times we think of foodborne related illnesses occurring on a grander scale. However, 70% of foodborne related illnesses actually originate in our homes. And that's because we become lackadaisical with practicing good food handling techniques and making sure that we're washing our hands and cleaning up after ourselves. So if you joined us last week, you saw this diagram, and this diagram is really important because our goal for food preservation is to increase the shelf life of food while keeping it safe. And in order to do that, we have to understand the ideal growing conditions for harmful microorganisms. And these 6 contributing factors not only are important for the harmful microorganisms to grow, but they also are important when it comes to food spoilage. And so we want to manipulate and control each of these to the best of our ability so that we can, again, enjoy our harvest and our hard work all year long. So freezing. What is freezing? Freezing is actually the reduction of the temperature of food, and we're dropping those temperatures down so that those harmful microorganisms, we're going to slow the rate in which they can grow. And we're also going to slow down the activity of enzymes. Freezing doesn't stop enzyme activity, it only slows it down. And so we already talked about some of the advantages of freezing, but with freezing, we also have some challenges. For example, freezing is going to change the texture of our products. And there's going to be substantial cost, whether it's buying our freezer packaging materials, maintaining a freezer, or simply dealing with electricity issues. Because if you have a freezer full of your summer harvest and the electricity goes out, you kind of find yourself in a bit of a pickle, especially if you don't have a generator to keep that freezer going. The other issue is you have to have enough storage space. And so different freezers are going to take up substantial space, and maybe you are part of the little home movement and you just don't have a lot of space. So again, these are all considerations, all challenges that we may need to address. And always remember, freezing does not improve the quality of your product. So you always need to start with good quality produce anytime you're doing any type of food preservation. Now, I'm a firm believer in helping people understand the why behind the recommendation. And so we're just going to take a few minutes here and we're going to do a brief overview of the freezing process. So the science of freezing is really kind of interesting. Food and water are going to actually freeze differently. And when water freezes and ice crystals form, there's actually a small amount of heat produced. Well, that's kind of interesting. I never really would have thought about that had I not really put a lot of thought into it. The temperature of water is going to remain at that 30 degrees as ice crystals grow. And then the rapid temperature drop occurs as the ice crystals are going to cool. Because food are a complex mixture of many different substances, their freezing point is actually below the freezing point of water. A slow temperature drop occurs and ice crystals are going to form within that food. The temperature then drops much more quickly as the crystal cools inside of the food. And then each food is going to freeze differently based on what it consists of. So the amount of water, if there's sugar in it, if we're talking about meat, the muscle tissue, or how much air is actually in the food. So that's kind of a super complicated, long spiel. So if we were to look at it a little bit differently, and I'm a visual person, so I like to have examples. So think of a water bottle. You take a water bottle, you stick it in the freezer, and what ends up happening? That water bottle is going to freeze. As it freezes, the water is going to expand. What may end up happening, the cap that was on top of your water bottle, it can get popped off because of the pressure as the water is expanding. The expanding, so if you're thinking about it in the sense of fruits and vegetables, the water within your plant cells, as that freezes, is going to expand as well. As those cell walls, or as the water expands, those cell walls are going to rupture or essentially break. And then what ends up happening is when that food becomes thawed, the texture is going to be compromised because the overall structure has been damaged. And that way that is why we end up with a softer texture. We may end up with water, a lot of extra water. I think about freezing zucchini. So if I freeze my zucchini, if I cube it, blanch it, put it in the freezer, when I go to thaw it, it's going to be much smushy. It's going to be mushy and smushy, and there's going to be a lot of extra water in the bag. And that is because zucchini has a higher water content, and all of that water seeped out from those cell walls when they broke. So the extent of the cell wall rupturing can be controlled by freezing products as quickly as possible. So that's the good thing. And that is going to help us better understand one of the recommendations when it comes to freezing our food. So kind of just to recap how freezing affects our food, it changes the texture. And that is because the cell walls rupture, leading to a softer texture. And it's going to be much more noticeable in foods that have a higher water content compared to foods that have a higher starch content and have less of a water content. So again, I'm a visual person. I thought these balloons were perfect examples of what I want to share with you today. So rapid freezing improves the quality of the food. The faster the food freezes, the smaller the ice crystals that will be formed. The small ice crystals are going to do less damage to the cell walls. So maybe it's not going to pop like that center balloon. Maybe instead it's just going to expand to max capacity and then shrivel back up like the balloon at the end. And so again, having that fast freezing process is going to result in smaller crystals, and those smaller crystals are going to do less damage. Slower freezing, on the other hand, is going to produce much larger ice crystals, and that's going to cause the cell walls to be punctured. And then that is going to result in the seeping or the loss of that liquid. Again, thinking back to my example of freezing zucchini. The other thing I want to point out is that if you have a freeze-thaw cycle occurring, then those ice crystals, maybe they started out small because you froze them really quickly, but if you're opening the freezer door frequently, as soon as that hot air hits the cold air, condensation is going to occur, but also there's going to be a slight temperature drop, and that is going to contribute to the freeze-thaw cycle. So when I say you want things to freeze quickly, what I mean, like a fast freeze, that is going to occur at approximately 13 degrees or less. A slower freeze is going to occur at a negative 11 degrees or above. Now, again, that's only a difference of 2 degrees, but that just goes to show there doesn't have to be a significant temperature fluctuation to impact the quality of product when you are then freezing. All right, so another thing that affects the quality of our food when we're freezing is temperature fluctuations. I shared with you just the difference of the 2 degrees, you know, how that can make a difference. But that freeze-thaw cycle, again, can be impacted by the temperature fluctuations, but also, and I have ice cream here because, again, anyone that attends my programs knows that I love to figure out a way that I can incorporate ice cream into my presentations. This is a good example, but maybe I should put up cream-style corn. That's something I grew up that my mom would freeze a lot. And because of the fat content, the crystals can be impacted by that as well. All right, so freezer burn. Freezer burn is another challenge that foods are faced with during the freezing process. And so freezer burn is the evaporation that occurs during the freeze-thaw cycle, and that results in dehydration of your product. Who knew? Again, food's produced, our products can become dehydrated. It's really a lot more complex than we really realize, and that's why we have the recommendations that we do, because there is a lot of science behind food preservation, and we want you to have the best quality product so that you can enjoy the items that you're freezing because it's a lot of work. So again, please try your best to follow the recommendations. So again, freezer burn, it's due to the dehydration of your product. And we use the term freezer burn, and we can see it visually because a lot of times it's gonna look dry. It may have a grayish brown spots on the surface of your food, and it's going to be a lot more noticeable in meats because they are frequently inadequately wrapped. And even though our focus today for food preservation is on fruits and vegetables, freezing your harvest, perhaps you are freezing your own meats. Maybe you ordered a half a beef from the local market, or maybe you're just purchasing the larger packages of meat and then resizing them into smaller containers. So just be really mindful that you know, freezer burn does occur, and meat products can be susceptible to that. Now, also I want you to know freezer burn is not unsafe. It simply leads to a less desirable flavor and texture issues. And I was that college student who pulled some stuff out of the freezer and said, I don't know what this is, but I'm really hungry and I can't go to the store. So let me figure it out. And and I ate it and I lived, but it was really just for nourishment, not necessarily because it tasted very good. And I'm sure perhaps maybe others can relate to that. All right. Another challenge that we face with freezing is understanding enzyme activity. Enzymes are large protein molecules that are found in animals, fruits, and vegetables, and they promote chemical reactions before and after harvest, such as ripening, the ripening process. The activity of enzymes is going to be very specific to the actual type of enzyme, and it's going to be dependent on both pH and temperature. Again, thinking back to those 6 factors that we're working to contribute or to manipulate to help control the rate at which food spoils. So enzyme activity helps to speed up the deterioration or the breakdown of food, and therefore it can lead to a lesser quality product. And it can really have an effect on the loss of nutrients, specifically in fruits, the vitamin C, and it can impact and change the color, texture, and flavor of foods. And again, remember, freezing simply slows down enzyme activity. It does not stop it. And I will tell you how we stop that activity later in a few more slides. The other thing I want to point out about food preservation in general is that you cannot compare the items that you are making with home food preservation to that of which you can find in the grocery store from a food manufacturer. You can't really compare them. You're not comparing apples to apples. Food manufacturers, they have a lot of tricks of the trade. They're able to add special ingredients. They can add thickeners that are going to impact the viscosity, the density, and other properties within the food that you're preserving. However, you could get a home glass freezer. Food manufacturers often use that when they're freezing. The only thing is they're super expensive. But a glass freezer can freeze or chill your food very, very quickly by dropping the temperature extremely low, by using that circulating air at a very rapid speed. And what ends up happening during that process, we create extremely teeny tiny little ice crystals. And we already talked about ice crystals, and we know that the smaller the ice crystal, the better the product, and that's why we encourage people to freeze their food as quickly as possible. Also, when you freeze the food as quickly as possible, you're also going to be preventing moisture loss. All right, so when you're freezing, it's going to be important that you'll have all of the important equipment that you need. Having the right equipment makes your job that much easier. Here's just a quick and easy checklist for freezing, making sure that you have a large blanching kettle. I get a lot of questions with people. They'll call and they'll ask, hey, do I really have to blanch? And I tell them, well, the recommendation is for blanching, but at the end of the day, it's all about personal choice, right? So you're still going to need a large bowl. You're going to need cold water with ice, a timer, a food scale, quality, packaging materials. You need a freezer, you need labels, all those good things. So let's just talk briefly about freezers. You may be wondering what's best. Should I have a chest freezer or an upright freezer? Well, it really depends, and it comes down to personal preference. But it also comes down to available floor space. If you live in a small home and you don't have the space for a chest freezer, I can't say, oh, well, I recommend a chest freezer. Because you're like, well, I can't have a chest freezer because I don't have space. So again, you have to figure out what's going to work best for you. But what I can share with you, generally speaking, an upright freezer is going to be much easier to organize, and it's going to take up less floor space. However, a chest freezer is usually much more economical to operate. And then of course you have just your home refrigerator freezer combination. But keep in mind, every time you open up that freezer door, you're letting air come in. You're going to have that temperature differential, additional condensation is going to occur, so then you're going to have extra moisture. So always keep those different things in mind. The other thing you may want to consider, growing up, I grew up and my parents would get like a half a beef for the year. We had a huge garden, we froze tons of stuff. And so we had a chest freezer just for meat, and we had a freezer just for vegetables. And that way, the freezers weren't being open excessively, and it just seemed to work well for our family. But at the end of the day, it's a personal preference. So things you need to know about your freezer. First, you need to read your manual. I know, crazy. Who reads the manual? Believe it or not, a lot of people do. And if you want to have a quality product that you've worked hard when you are at the end of the season and pulling it out of the freezer in the middle of the winter, reading your manual can actually make a big difference. Some home freezer manuals are going to recommend what temperature to set your freezer at so you can have the coldest setting. And they're also going to recommend that you set it to the coldest setting several hours before you place a large amount of food in the freezer. In fact, some manuals are actually going to indicate the coldest shelves that are in the freezer. How cool is that, right? They're going to give you suggestions, essentially, where you should place different foods on the shelves. The other thing is you need to check the temperature of your freezer. A lot of people, they just plug it in. They don't really think much of it unless they pull things out and they're soft. But really, you should be checking the temperature of your freezer to make sure that it is working properly. Also, check for temperature fluctuations. Again, the more fluctuation, the more opportunity for additional moisture to build up within your freezer. And also, I want to caution you about self-defrosting freezers. With self-defrosting freezers, you have a constant temperature fluctuation. And so depending upon what you're putting in that particular freezer, you may not necessarily want a self-defrosting freezer. Again, personal preferences. The other important thing to keep in mind is that you are not to overload your freezer. Generally speaking, your manual is going to tell you the maximum number of cubic feet of unfrozen foods that can be placed in it at one time. A good general rule of thumb is 2 to 3 pounds of vegetables or food per cubic foot of freezer space per 24 hours. The recommendation, though, is really to decrease or lower the temperature of your freezer at least 24 hours prior to putting a large amount of vegetables into your freezer. If you overload your freezer, what ends up happening, you have a longer, slower freezing time, which is again going to result in a poor quality product. All right, packaging materials. Packaging materials make a difference. And there's lots of different types out there. We have rigid and non-rigid materials, and we're going to talk about non-rigid materials first. Packaging is really the key to retaining quality products. You want to keep the moisture in and the air out. Therefore, it's important to use good quality freezer containers that are going to both provide that moisture barrier and that vapor barrier and keep the air out as well. Packaging should protect your food from absorbing additional flavors within your freezer and protect it from freezer burn. Sometimes when I go and visit my sister, I open up her freezer and pull something out, and I was like, how come it smells like onions in your freezer? And she'll say, oh, well, I froze some onions and I just stuck them in there really quick. And then you realize, oh, it's like contaminating. It's making the other food in the freezer smell and or kind of taste like onions. So always be mindful of that. When it comes to non-rigid packaging, that's going to be things like your freezer bags. It could be also items like your heavy duty aluminum foils or your freezer wrap. And again, today our focus is on fruits and vegetables, but the heavy duty aluminum and the freezer wrap is most likely going to be used for some type of meat product. If you are using aluminum foil, I just really want to stress that you should not be using a lightweight aluminum. Always use the heavy duty because it's going to provide a better barrier. Non-rigid containers, when you're using a non-rigid container, make sure you press all of the air out of the bag. Again, oxygen is one of those 6 factors that contribute to food spoilage. Make sure that the seal has been secured. A lot of times if you spill on there, you want to take a clean cloth, maybe a single-use paper towel, and wipe that edge off. So it's going to have a good seal. And of course, label, 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 because 6 months down the road, if there's been a lot of freezer damage that's occurred to your food, you may be wondering, is this strawberries or is this tomatoes? And you really don't want to make that mistake. The other question that I get from a lot of consumers is vacuuming packaging. People want to know, should I go ahead and spend the money to go ahead and buy a vacuum packaging system? And I always say, like, okay, well, why do you want to get a vacuum packaging system? Is it because it's cool? Is it because, you know, it's just a new gadget? Because when you are purchasing it, there is a substantial cost involved. Plus, you have to buy their specific packaging materials, not just the vacuum machine, but you also have to buy their materials. And so with a vacuum seal, what you're doing is you're removing all of the air from the contents of that package. And really, if you follow the recommendations for freezing and you follow them exactly and you use good quality packaging, you're going to have an equally high quality product that you're going to be able to use without the substantial cost. The other thing I want to caution you about when it comes to vacuum packaging, don't be lulled into a false sense of security because you still have to practice safe food handling practices when you are working with that vacuum sealed product. So, for example, if it's something that is intended to be refrigerated, you're not going to want to leave it out longer than 2 hours, especially if the temperature is 40 degrees or above. You also want to make sure you label and date, and you want to use it in a reasonable amount of time. Moving on to rigid packaging. So rigid packaging is really a nice option for some people, especially if you're like, hey, I'm using way too much plastic, and every time I use a plastic bag, I'm thinking about how I'm filling the landfill full of plastic. So rigid packaging may be an option for you if that is something that you're concerned about, because a lot of times the packaging is reusable. However, you have to be wise when you're doing that. Rigid packaging is commonly used for foods that are semi-liquid, liquid, or if you're packing a liquid pack type food, so maybe like soup. And you have to also be cautious. So I bought some really cute plastic freezer safe containers. And first off, they're cute, so why wouldn't I get them? But the issue that I found with them is that the lids kept popping off. So that was a problem. You can also use wide mouth canning jars. However, you can easily bump those and they can become cracked, they can become brittle. When you're using containers, make sure that you're using containers that are safe to be used in the freezer. And again, rigid containers, they're gonna hold their shape. They can be stored upright, but that can also be a problem if you don't necessarily have adequate space. Always make sure that the lid is on very tight. Make sure that the seal on the edge is also clean so that the lid is going to more likely than not stay on there safely. If you have an issue with the lids popping off, You may want to consider putting a little freezer tape on that. Keep in mind, freezer tape is not the same as masking tape. If you use masking tape, that masking tape is not going to stand up more than a couple hours in the freezer, I think. At least mine didn't. So I went out and got some freezer tape because that's specially formulated, the adhesive, so that it will stay together in the freezer. And of course, always label your foods. So the other thing when we're talking about rigid containers is we have to allow headspace. Now, for those that were able to join us last week and we were talking about canning, we spoke about headspace. And so headspace is going to be the distance between the bottom of your lid and the top of your product. And when you're freezing, what ends up happening, again, that food is going to expand. And so you need to allow enough headspace to make sure that lid doesn't get popped off and that it doesn't expand and end up cracking your container. It's also important that you don't leave too much headspace, because if you leave too much headspace, you're going to have additional oxygen in there, and that can affect the color, the flavor, and the texture of your food items. I do not do this, but I thought it was a really handy idea. So one way to deal with that headspace is if you take a crumpled piece of freezer paper and put in the top, that will take up additional space, and then that is supposed to help reduce some of that space from air that can occur. All right, freezer containers. Again, this is just a general statement regarding freezer containers. Always make sure that your freezer containers are truly freezer containers. Now, I grew up with my mom reusing, recycling, repurposing. So, you know, she uses cottage cheese containers and Cool-Up containers, yogurt containers, and all of that good stuff. But really, you should be using quality containers that are intended to be used multiple times, reused. And when you purchase them, on the packaging material, it's going to say for freezer use. There's a variety of shapes, a variety of sizes. Again, they're nice because they're reusable. However, what I would recommend, do not take, let's say you, here, you know, with these little green cups here, let's pretend that there's soup in there. You're not going to want to take that container and take it from the freezer to the microwave, because if there's soup in there and there's a high fat content, that fat can then permeate the edges of your plastic container and damage it. So really, I would not recommend that. You can use freezer bags. The screw-on lids are nice because you can get them really tight and they're less likely to pop off. The other thing, and I've said this once, but I have to say it again, label, 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 label and date. Name what the product is. Is this tomatoes? Is this strawberries? Now, if it's strawberries, did you add sugar? Did you not add sugar? Is it whole strawberries or half strawberries? How old is it? How many servings? All of those things that are very important. Now, this is probably what you've all been waiting for. I wanted to give you kind of like the why behind the recommendations, but now we're going to start talking about blanching, and then we're going to talk about freezing fruit, because again, a lot more science is going to be involved. But you might be freezing and you're like, okay, great, what am I going to do with this? And the thing that I always stress is begin with the end in mind. Know what the intended use of your produce item, whether it's a fruit or vegetable, is going to be used for. Some general tips for freezing: always make sure that your your produce item, has cooled before you freeze it. That way it'll help speed up the freezing process. Freeze foods as soon as they're packaged. So what you may end up doing is, let's say you're doing cream style corn. My mom would cook that up, you know, we would bag it, stick it in the fridge to let it cool, and then stick it in the freezer so that it would freeze more rapidly. But she would allow for a little bit of time in between before putting it in the freezer right away. Freeze foods as quickly as possible. Set your freezer to at least a -10, 24 hours before freezing. Again, if you can, maybe aim for that -11, a -13, but at least a -10, 24 hours prior. And then pack, pack your freezer items in the serving sizes and specify that. If you used to have a family with a family of 6, and now your kids have grown up and moved away, and now you have 2, then you can say, okay, well, this bag of corn has 2 servings, but this bag of corn has 4 servings. That way, if I have company, I know which bag to pull out. Also, package your food tightly, removing any additional air. When it comes to freezing your vegetables, always select high quality vegetables and select the variety that's going to be best for freezing because there are different varieties within each type of vegetable and they're not all created equal. Harvest your produce and your vegetables just before you're ready to freeze. When you are washing and cleaning your vegetables or fruits, work in small batches. Make sure that you're preventing recontamination. And because you don't want to clean your peas and then accidentally get them in dirty water all over again. You really want to prevent that from happening. Work in small batches, blanch if recommended. And again, we're going to get more into the details on blanching. Use proper packaging and remove excessive air and moisture. Remember, freezing does not improve the quality of your produce. That is super important. The other thing that's important to understand is that not all foods are going to freeze equally. There are certain foods that are just not going to result in a good quality product. So foods that have really high water content, like celery, your greens, like your lettuce or spinach, potatoes, peppers and onions or Irish potatoes. There are certain foods that just simply aren't going to freeze well. Now, talking more specifically about freezing vegetables, we've already kind of covered that. Now we're going to talk about blanching. So blanching, you have your produce, you're preparing it, you're going to go ahead and submerge it in hot water very, very quickly. Then you're going to cool it very quickly. You're going to freeze it, and then you're going to package it. So let's peel that back. So blanching is not required from a food safety standpoint. However, it is going to affect the quality of your product. And it is recommended for almost all vegetables that are going to be frozen. Blanching is a process of quickly heating and quickly cooling your items to destroy that enzyme activity. Blanching does several different things. One, it's actually going to stop enzyme activity. Remember, freezing will slow it down. It doesn't stop it. If you want to stop it, you need to apply that heat through the blanching process. So blanching is also going to clean the surface of dirt and other microorganisms. It's going to brighten the color. It's going to reduce the loss of vitamins, and it's going to soften your vegetables. So it's going to be a little bit easier to package, especially if you're packaging using rigid containers. The amount of time that is going to be required for blanching is really going to vary depending upon the type of vegetable and the size. So think the density of the product. Again, going back to those 6 primary foundations of controlling the environment to reduce food spoilage. So again, it's going to depend on the type of vegetable, the size of the vegetable. Cooling is incredibly important, and making sure that we have the timing down. Under blanching is going to actually stimulate enzyme activity, and it can lead to a worse product compared to not blanching at all. And over blanching can result in the loss of flavor, color, and key nutrients. Now, There are 3 types of blanching. However, one of them is not recommended. Can you guess? All right, the first one we're going to talk about is steam blanching. Steam blanching is when you use, you just put 1 to 2 inches of boiling water in the bottom of a pan, or put the water in, bring it up to a boil. And you need to have a basket that you can drop in there and have a tight fitting lid. And you're going to place a single layer of vegetables in the bottom of that basket. Once you put the vegetables in there, cover, and then begin starting your time. And the thing about steam blanching is that it's going to take 1.5 times longer compared to that of water blanching. So water blanching is really what I would recommend, and it's what I do. Although I always feel like it's a 3-ring circus when I'm trying to blanch, or blanching, not trying to, I am. Because to me, it takes a lot of coordination. And I think that as time goes on, you just get better and better at it. But I think that you really have to be well organized and have everything set up ahead of time. And you also have to have the right equipment, kind of going back to that equipment checklist. So water blanching, you're going to use about 1 gallon of water per 1 pound of vegetables. And it's recommended that you're working in small batches. And so the other thing you have to keep in mind is that you're going to have to keep adding water, because as you're blanching, water is going to be evaporating off. So you have to continually be adding additional water. The other thing that you need to be doing is when you are blanching, you can use a blanching pot where you have a basket. You can put that in. I don't have a blanching pot, so I just kind of dump it in and then fish them out, like the pictures here. Yeah, I just use a slotted spoon. But when you place your vegetables in your basket and lower it, it should return to a vigorous boil within 1 minute. If it doesn't return to that vigorous boil within 1 minute, that is an indication that you're putting too much produce, too much volume into your water. Then you're going to, once it returns to that boil, put the cover on, and then begin, or when it returns to that boil is when you're going to begin timing. Microwave blanching. So for those that guessed, microwave blanching wasn't recommended, you were correct. Yay, right? So microwave blanching may not be as effective, since research shows that some of the enzymes may not be inactivated. And so keep in mind, there's hot and cold spots within a microwave. And so we really can't regulate it as closely as we would if we were steam blanching or water blanching. And if we're not inactivating those enzymes, that can lead to an off flavor. It can lead to loss of color and texture. Plus, it's not going to save time or energy. Now, again, we're all about free choice, personal choice. So if you are going to do it, if it's done, make sure that you follow the specified recommendations for your microwave. Make sure you're working in small quantities, and make sure that you're changing the water that you're using to actually blanch your produce in. All right, rapid cooling. This is super, super important when you're blanching, whether you're blanching with water, steam, or the microwave. As soon as blanching is complete, the vegetables need to be cooled quickly as possible to stop the cooking process. And to do that, what you're going to do is go ahead and submerge the vegetables. Excuse me. Submerge the vegetables into a mixture of cold water, a lot of times ice and water mixture, so we can stop that cooking process. And when we say cold water, specifically we mean a temperature of 60 degrees or below. So if you're going to be using the ice with the cold water, and that's really what I recommend, and it's that time of year that I'm always like, oh, I wish my refrigerator had an ice maker, because you go through a lot of ice. It's 1 pound of ice per pound of vegetables. So again, you are going to go through a lot of ice, and you're going to need to change that water out as well. When you're done cooling, make sure that you drain the vegetables, and you make sure that there is no excessive amount of moisture, because if you have additional moisture, it's going to lead to a decreased quality of product. All right, I cannot tell you how many times I have people call and ask me, do I really need to blanch? And I always tell them the recommendation is yes. And they're like, okay, well, I don't want to. What will happen? So for those that don't want to blanch, you don't have to. Again, from a food safety standpoint, it's not recommended. It's from a quality standpoint. So you can store unblanched vegetables for up to 3 months. So it's recommended that you use them within 3 months. However, the other caveat is you're going to have a change in quality. Perhaps you chose not to blanch your vegetables. You can have the color be either a faded or a dull color. You could end up with an off flavor. And sometimes the texture actually ends up being slightly slimy. So again, it's all up to you. When you're freezing your vegetables, there are different types of packaging. You can dry pack or you can tray pack. Dry packing, you're going to blanch, cool, drain, remove the air, put it in a little bag, and then put it in the freezer. If you're tray packing, you're going to spread everything out on a single layer on a shallow pan, stick it in the freezer so it can lay flat, allow it to freeze. Again, it's going to depend on the density of the product. What are you freezing? How cold is your freezer? What else is in there? How many times are you opening the door? But generally speaking, you should be able to freeze it within that first hour. If it's not frozen after that first hour, then maybe set a timer and say I'm going to check back every 30 minutes, kind of based off of how frozen it was before. Once it has been frozen, you can take it off that tray and then put it into a bag, of course, label, date, all that good stuff, and it's going to be loose. And when you tray pack, it's going to prevent foods from clumping. All right, now we're going to talk about freezing fruit. So freezing fruit is a little bit more tricky than vegetables. And that's because fruit generally is going to have a much higher water content compared to a lot of our vegetables. So how you freeze your food is really, really going to make a difference. You want to select high quality fruit, and you want to make sure that you have optimal maturity and freshness. And as we go through our series, for example, if we're talking about jams and jellies, you need to have a combination of either ripe or overripe, ripe or underripe fruit if you're making certain types of jelly based on the pectin levels. So those are things you have to take into consideration, because I also get a lot of questions like, well, I don't have enough berries to make strawberry jam. Can I just freeze them and then use them later? And the answer is yes, but, because again, what is the intended project that you're going to be doing? What do you want to do with those berries? How are you going to use them? When are you going to use them? Are you going to use them in a week? Are you going to use them in a month? Are you going to use them in 2 or 3 months? All of those things make a difference. And so there isn't one simple short answer. The other thing is, when we're talking about fruit, you want to make sure that you're not using galvanized, copper, or iron equipment. And that is because there can be a chemical reaction that occurs between the acid in the fruit and the compounds that are in those different types of metals. And that can either cause an off flavor, or there can be a chemical reaction that causes harmful reactions. So again, I always select high quality fruit, wash, sort, drain, work in small batches, change the water frequently. Here is a secret. When I was younger, I thought if I soaked my strawberries that I would end up with, cleaner strawberries. The reality is, don't soak your strawberries. Don't leave your fruit in water for a long, or any vegetable really for that matter, for a long period of time, because it's going to absorb that extra moisture. And is going to result in a watery, less flavorful fruit or berry. The other thing is when it comes to blueberries, do not wash your blueberries before you freeze them. If you do, that can result in having a much tougher skin on the blueberry. Also, make sure you pit, hull, peel, slice, dice, you know, whatever you're going to do with your berry, and always use proper packaging, remove excessive air and moisture. All right, so the other thing we're going to talk about is making sure that we're working to prevent discoloration. A lot of times, the fruit that we're working with is going to be impacted by the air. Again, oxygen, one of the 6 factors. So preventing discoloration, what works well? Well, using ascorbic acid. So 1 teaspoon per 1 gallon of cool water is very helpful in preventing the discoloration. So some fruits such as peaches, apples, pears, apricots, they're going to darken very quickly when they're exposed to air and during the freezing process. And so if you want to make sure that you're not losing that flavor when they're thawed, you can use different products to help them prevent that darkening from occurring. So ascorbic acid or vitamin C is really preferred because it's super effective at preventing that discoloration, and it's also going to help add a little nutrient value because, again, it's vitamin C. There are also ascorbic acid mixtures, and those mixtures are going to be a combination of sugar and ascorbic acid. And people may say, like, okay, well, where can I find ascorbic acid? Well, you can actually get it from some local pharmacies in the powdered version or the tablet version. I would caution you, if you're using a tablet, you have to crush it into a powder to make sure that it can then get dissolved in the water. And so there's that. And I personally, I just buy whatever commercial product is available. And I want to also encourage you to make sure that you don't confuse ascorbic acid with citric acid. Citric acid and ascorbic acid are not the same. And citric acid, lemon juice, or other fruit juices can interfere or mask the natural flavor of the fruit, and they're not as effective as ascorbic acid. Salt and vinegar solutions, those are no longer recommended. So if that is something you would like to use, just make sure you do your homework and make sure that it's not something that's going to, or make sure that it's something that's going to complement the flavor versus compete against the flavor. All right, we're almost done. So freezing methods for fruit. There are unsweetened packs. There's a couple different ways. There's unsweetened packs, sweetened packs. There's the dry sugar or unsweetened. And then there's the fruit packed in syrup. So you always need to know, again, what the intended use is for that fruit, as that will determine how it's going to be freezed. So if you're going to freeze strawberries and then in December, when you have more time, you're going to then use it to make strawberry jam, you need to make sure that you're recording that, because you need to know what the ratio of sugar to berry is, because that's going to impact the pectin and the fruit acid. So again, those are all things that are very important to make sure that you're writing down and labeling for your products. Fruits that are packed in syrup are generally best for uncooked desserts. Those packed in dry sugar or unsweetened are best for cooking purposes because they're going to have less liquid in the product. If they're packed in syrup or sugar, that's going to help retain the color, the taste, and the texture. But sugar isn't necessary from a food safety standpoint. So again, you really need to know what you're going to be using that particular product for. The portion of sugar to water depends upon the sweetness of the fruit that's going to be frozen. A 40% syrup is generally recommended for most fruits. Lighter syrups are desirable for mild flavored fruits to prevent the masking of the flavors, compared to heavier flavors may be needed for your more sour fruits. So if you have sour cherries versus sweet cherries. Making a syrup pack is really easy. You can use lukewarm water, dissolve the sugar in it, stir it until that sugar is dissolved. Stick it in the fridge for a little bit so it can chill, and then go ahead and cover the fruit. And fruits should be covered with 1/2 to 2/3 cup per pint is the recommendation. The process for sugar packs, again, this is a different process versus a syrup pack. The sugar pack, what you're going to do is you're going to, let's say you have sliced strawberries. You're going to do a layer of strawberries, sprinkle a layer of sugar, and then continue to layer. You're going to mix very gently until the sugar dissolves. You're going to let it stand for 15 minutes. And what's going to end up happening, that sugar is going to pull some of the liquid out. And that should create a significant amount of syrup to cover what your fruit is. And this is going to work really good for strawberries, peaches, figs, seeded grapes, plums, and cherries. And if you have some smaller whole fruits, you can simply just coat them with sugar and then go ahead and freeze. Our unsweetened packs are typically considered our dry packs, and those are going to be good for whole fruits, such as our berries, that don't need to have sugar added, that's still going to result in a really good quality product. It's really simple. All you need to do is you can either tray pack it, or you can just go ahead and pack it into a container and freeze. Our unsweetened packs for fruit, we have a couple different options. Unsweetened packs generally yield a product that doesn't have as plump of a texture or good of a color compared to that of those that are packed with sugar. However, some of the fruits, such as raspberries, blueberries, currants, cranberries, rhubarb, and figs, you're going to get a good quality product without the addition of that sugar. So you don't even really need to worry about it. If you're going to pack with purees or juices, you're going to want to make sure that you're adding that ascorbic acid for those fruits and purees that have a lighter color to them. And then our last one that we're going to talk, well, our second to the last one we're going to talk about is our pectin syrup. So the pectin syrup is going to be really good for strawberries and peaches. And it's really simple. Just follow the instructions on the packaging. Generally, it's going to be 1 package of pectin powder to 1 cup of water. You're going to bring it to a boil for a minute, remove from the heat, let it cool, and then add an additional 1 3/4 cup water. And then you can go ahead, as long as it's cool, and pour that over your fruits. All right, artificial sweeteners. So follow the manufacturer's instructions. And sugar substitutes are artificial sweeteners. They can be used if the intent for the sugar isn't that it's adding volume. Sugar substitutes may be in any of the unsweetened packs. They can be added prior to freezing or just before serving. I personally like to do it just before serving, if in the event that I decide at the last minute, like, oh wait, I'm gonna use this for something else, then I don't have to worry about the issues with heating certain artificial sweeteners or sugar substitutes. So they can be used if you're using a pectin syrup, the juice, the water, again, or just add before serving. However, I just want to caution you, again, you're not going to have the protective factors offered by sugar when you're using our artificial sweetener. So it's not going to help retain the color, and it's not going to help with the texture of your product. All right, so now we have some of the basic tools of the trade. We want to talk about storing our produce. So how long can I store my frozen food? Well, it really depends. It depends on, you know, how the type of freezer you have, how full it is, how often the door is getting open, how did you preserve it, how did you freeze it, what steps did you take. But here are some real General guidelines, fruits and vegetables, generally speaking, 8 to 12 months. And again, this is from a quality standpoint, not necessarily a food safety standpoint. And then you can just look the list yourself there. All right, vegetable storage. What do we need to know about that? Vegetables will still be safe if kept frozen longer than the times that are posted in today's presentation. And again, it's from a quality standpoint. However, the vegetables are going to continue to deteriorate. Recommended storage times for frozen foods are really for the best quality of your product. And so you have an idea here. And so again, looking, if your freezer is only at 30 degrees, it's not gonna stay as good from a quality standpoint. So making sure that you're looking at the temperature of your freezer and making sure that it's where it should be. All right, summing things up, food safety, food preservation is a great tool to use. And there may be more startup costs. Always practice food safety and stay up to date on your resources. And here's a listing of our resources. One thing I want to point out at the University of Illinois Extension, we have Mary Liz Wright. What's Cooking with Mary Liz Wright? There's a lot of great videos with helpful tips and tricks to watch. So any questions? I know it's 5 after, Susan.
Yes, Diane, thank you. We had a lot of questions and we were responding to what we could as we went through your presentation, but I did put a couple down to ask you and we'll see how far we get. So thank you for all of the questions, everybody. First, Diane, when you were talking about fast freeze versus slow freeze, would you quickly repeat that for us?
Okay, let's get that. So I guess just repeat all of that information, or with regards to the 11, negative 11 versus negative 13.
Yes, that information, the temperature information was part of the question. Thank you.
Okay, so again, you want to freeze as quickly as possible. And so making sure that when you're freezing, that you're freezing as quickly as possible. And still looking through my notes because I don't want to miss heat. So rapid freezing improves the quality of food. And so the faster you freeze your food, the smaller ice crystals that are going to actually be formed. And having those small ice crystals actually does less damage to the cell walls. And so having those small ice crystals are going to result in a better quality product. And so this is especially noticeable if you have a freeze-off cycle that is occurring, and fast freezing occurs at a negative 13 degrees or less, and slow freezing occurs at negative 11 degrees or above.
Okay, great, thank you. Couple more. Is it better to freeze or to cool food in the fridge, or just put it straight into deep freeze? What would you recommend?
So is it specific to freezing vegetables?
It wasn't really specific, but initially freezing food, like cool it before it goes into deep freeze.
So if you're cutting and dicing your carrots and you blanch them, and once you've blanched them, then you're cooling them for that amount of time, then I would just go ahead and package them and stick them in the freezer. But if you were making some, recipe like cream style corn, like my mom did, she would pull that out of the oven and it would still be warm while we were packaging it. So we would just stick it in the fridge for 10 minutes or whatnot before we put it in the freezer.
Thank you. And I know we always recommend that you cool food if you're heating and something and you're going to freeze it. that you cool it first before it goes into the freezer. Okay, so when we were talking about the fruits, would you soak fruit in ascorbic acid before freezing? There was a question with those slides.
Yeah, so with your fruit, depending upon, you know, what it is, if you have your apples, your peaches, and things like that, you're going to want to go ahead and not necessarily soak it, but dip it in your water, your ascorbic acid solution before packaging it.
Great, thank you. I'm just responding and reading and trying to get everybody's questions. Any tips on freezing fresh picked tomatoes to use later for canning?
I would say blanch them.
Okay.
Yep. That is a question I get a lot of.
Yeah,
and a lot of people, they don't want to blanch them because it's a lot of extra time and effort, and they just have a few, but the recommendation is to blanch them.
Great. Okay, we'll try to get one more question in. And this was when we were talking about temperatures. Would you recommend, if you have a temperature gauge in the fridge, that you still have your own thermometer that you check your temperatures with?
In your fridge or your freezer? Either one.
I'm sorry, in your freezer.
Yeah, either one. I would definitely be doing your own testing with your own thermometers.
Okay.
You know, you have the one that's built into the freezer, but having your own is just an extra check and balance.
Yeah, that extra check. Yes. Okay. We have one more question. Can you put ascorbic acid in a water bath?
So when I hear water bath, I think of water bath candy. Like you put it in the water, or what? I guess I don't understand the question.
Yeah, we'll have to maybe get some more information on that one. That was one of our last ones listed here. Okay, so I think we'll move ahead and finish up. So thank you everybody for listing your questions. We really appreciate that interaction. And thank you, Diane, for all that information. We want to remind you that next week, next Wednesday, June 17th, we're going to be talking about fermenting foods at home. And we're really excited to offer this as part of Fill Your Pantry, our home webinar series. And so you can register for that. And then also on our next slide, we want to remind you that you can sign up for our texting program. And with that, you can sign up at go.illinois.edu/wellness-tips. And you will get information as you go through, but no more than 2 texts per week. And we don't share the number, and you can stop anytime. And then we want to thank you for attending. We did list some additional resources on this slide. I think we shared the What's Cooking with Mary Liz Wright link in the chat box. But if you go into YouTube and just search What's Cooking with Mary Liz, it will pop up for those University of Illinois Extension videos. And there's a lot of information in there on canning and freezing for you to look at. We also have our Around the Table Facebook page. And then our website, there's the Nutrition and Wellness website, go.illinois.edu/nutritionwell. And then our main website, extension.illinois.edu. So remember to watch for surveys in your email. After that's returned, we really appreciate your feedback. There will be handouts coming out. Also, this webinar was recorded, and so it will be housed on the Extension website. And we want to thank you for joining University of Illinois Extension, and we wish everybody a wonderful day. So thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you, Diane.
All right, thank you, and everyone have a wonderful week. Thank you.
Great, thank you.